Greetings, friends. Welcome to my channel. I'm Alexander Musienko. Today, March 25th, Tuesday, and as usual, I have a briefing for you on the news that I consider relevant, important, and worthy of your esteemed attention. And as usual, there is plenty to talk about. I'll start with the successes of the Ukrainian Defense Forces, the Armed Forces of Ukraine. The fact is, there are reports that Ukrainian Defense Forces have advanced in the Dvorikna area in the Kharkiv region. The enemy is trying to establish a foothold there, but Ukrainian military forces are countering and have improved their position. These were very important, albeit small, operations by the defense forces. This was reported by the deputy commander of the 429th Separate Unmanned Systems Regiment, Achilles Oles Malyarevich. He noted that the enemy has no territorial gains, but is constantly in a state of assault. This concerns the Dvorikhna-Kolesnikivka area. And now, Ukrainian forces have effectively managed, within the framework of active maneuver defense, to push the enemy's positions from certain lines. In other words, the Ukrainian defense forces are defending, continuing to destroy the enemy, and reducing its offensive potential. Moreover, they are taking advantage of the opportunity to effectively liberate our territories. This is happening right now, regardless of what information is being spread. The enemy, whatever they try to say about creating encirclements, cauldrons, or other traditional things, but in reality, the defense forces continue to resist, and in some places very, very successfully. Since I mentioned what Russian war correspondents are writing, they are in agony over the Belgorod region. The thing is that propaganda sites, Russian and active Telegram channels write that this is not the first time. They constantly write about the Belgorod region, that something is happening there, that enemy positions are being destroyed there, that military infrastructure is being destroyed, and Russian troops are not being allowed to the border with Ukraine. So, as they note, supposedly these are again Russian war correspondents writing. We don't have official data, but they are in constant agony, so why not mention it? So they write that special forces of the Armed Forces of Ukraine entered the village of Popivka in the Belgorod region. And in fact, the special forces of the Armed Forces of Ukraine entered Belgorod's Popivka and are storming the stronghold. The border guards called fire upon themselves, according to the publications. And they are actually trying to destroy bunkers with Russian soldiers using grenades. Our special units note the Russians in this way. Well, what can be said about calling fire upon themselves? This, of course, well, this should be epically attached to propaganda that they are holding the fire on themselves and so on. But in reality, we actually see that the Ukrainian defense forces are operating along the front line, currently holding our positions. Because the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, in an interview with The Time to the well-known journalist Simon Schuster, who also wrote a book about the war and about the president of Ukraine, Zelensky. So in fact, Volodymyr Zelensky is saying that the enemy is currently preparing to launch a major offensive on Ukrainian territory in the near future, and Putin plans to target the Zaporizhzhia direction, the east, Kharkiv and Sumy, to force Ukraine to concede. Ukraine has always maintained the position not to strike at energy infrastructure. Moreover, the president mentions that Ukrainian defense forces are preparing to counteract and know how to do it. This is very important. And the president of Ukraine, Zelensky, denied the encirclement of Ukrainian fighters in the Kursk region, and reports on the concentration of Russian troops at the Sumy border who are destroying Ukrainian forces with such operations, inflicting maximum losses on the enemy. And Zelensky claims that Ukrainian fighters are demonstrating that they are not encircled and do not submit to Putin. Currently, Russian troops are preparing for strikes on the Sumy, Kharkiv, and Zaporizhzhia regions. The president emphasizes that Ukraine will not allow this to happen. And we see that it is not allowed because the president of Ukraine has made similar statements before, and indeed this is being recorded. The Supreme Commander-in-Chief of Ukraine clearly states what is happening and the means of counteraction. This is evident. We see this because there is no significant advancement of the enemy being recorded. Instead, the enemy is suffering losses and cannot achieve their set goals. There are methods, and we see that the defense forces of Ukraine are effectively using them. Just look at the strikes on the Belgorod region, which continue with the aim of weakening the enemy. And this will continue in the future. The defense forces of Ukraine confidently know what to do and how to act here. At the same time, besides this, Russia, meanwhile, continues to lose aircraft because they had a Su-25 crash near the coastline. It simply crashed due to technical malfunctions. And why is that? Because the war is quite intense. Russia is deploying various types of aircraft. The strain on pilots is increasing. Many aircraft have been lost. And as a result, resources are being depleted. They don't manage to replenish in time. Consequently, mistakes are made more frequently. Additionally, consider that thanks to the successful actions of the Ukrainian defense forces, it was possible to push Russia away from using and having the capability to use the airfield network located close to the borders with Ukraine. As a result, they are forced to fly further, which also causes problems because they are using airfields where they haven't flown before and haven't trained. And this, of course, creates the corresponding difficulties, which, along with the entire accumulation of problems, do not lead to specifically such catastrophes. This also needs to be understood. All of this, in fact, is due to the war against Ukraine. Well, and in fact, there is a very interesting announcement about the successes of our forces. Now, attention, because for the first time, we used the Ukrainian missile Long Neptune against a military target in occupied Crimea. We also tested an entirely new system about which I cannot say anything yet. This was stated by the advisor to the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky Kamishin, who previously held the position of Minister of Strategic Industries. In other words, Ukraine, despite everything, is increasing its own capabilities in order to be able to strike the enemy, and we see that it is working. As stated by the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, any actions by Russia will not go unanswered. And here is an interview, well, quotes worth considering from the interview with Simon Schuster, the Supreme Commander-in-Chief of the President. Here is, let's say, quite a sharp remark, but it is entirely fair and correct. Here are the words of the President of Ukraine addressed to Donald Trump. In the midst of the Kursk operation, Donald Trump had a phone conversation with Putin, who reported the encirclement of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers. Although this was a lie, Trump continued to amplify it, said Zelensky. According to the president, US officials began to take Putin at his word, even when their own intelligence data contradicted his words. I believe that Russia managed to influence some people in the White House team. Their message to Americans was that Ukrainians do not want to end the war and something needs to be done to force them. Well, that's absolutely correct. We see that Russian propaganda is trying to infiltrate, including through social media, and into the American information space and the European, generally Western. Brachet distorts the data and information about what is actually happening. And of course, this cannot be allowed. So the president of Ukraine clearly explains, saying, look, this did not happen. This is a fake about the encirclement of Ukrainian troops in Kursk. This is all untrue. So why cultivate it? Why continue to spread it just to put pressure on Ukraine? That's the impression it gives. By the way, the pressure on Ukraine and the statement that was made and disseminated beforehand about President Trump saying that an agreement with Ukraine on rare earth minerals and metals will soon be signed. And then we move on to the territories, which is also a form of pressure on Ukraine, unfortunately. Because what does it mean to move on to the territories? This sequence was determined by the United States itself, by the administration of the US president, which states that first a ceasefire must be achieved, and initially everything comprehensive and unconditional, I emphasize, must be ensured regarding the ceasefire. And only after that, move on to resolving all other issues within the framework of a peaceful settlement. So why is this transition necessary? Well, I mean, there is a question. At the same time, As Simon Schuster noted, since Trump insists on ending the war, he, let's say, has reserved all the carrots for Russia, while Ukrainians will get the stick. This image made the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, smile and say the following. A very interesting response, and it is correctly constructed as it seems to me. This is correct. This was said by the president. And he says, if the carrot is poisoned, then thank God, perhaps this is the cunning of Trump's diplomacy. And Zelensky stated that if the American leader wants, he can extract concessions from the Russians. Since Trump seems to be the only one whom dictator Putin fears, well, actually, how much he fears, we shall see. At least there hasn't been, I think, a reason for Putin to be very afraid of Trump. Unfortunately, not yet. Trump and the USA have not demonstrated all their might, which, as Volodymyr Zelensky notes, they certainly possess. Similarly, the Ukrainian head of state denied the fact that the lack of providing intelligence data helped the Russians advance rapidly in the Kursk region. Indeed, it must be said that overall the situation is such that, in principle, there are opportunities for Ukrainian forces to receive information directly from the front, but of course, without the support of partners, it is more difficult. But here the president is absolutely right. And similarly, Zelensky noted that it is wrong to negotiate about Ukraine without Ukraine. The president emphasizes that Ukraine is not a salad or a compote for someone, but an independent state. Therefore, it is necessary to negotiate taking into account Ukrainian interests to achieve the desired result. And most importantly, as noted by the Supreme Commander-in-Chief, Ukraine will not leave Russian strikes on Ukrainian energy unanswered. Clear and an understandable position. In fact, well, in the meantime, we are waiting today. Throughout the day, the United States and Russia promise us a statement about the results of the meeting in Saudi Arabia today, and most likely there will be a corresponding meeting between the Ukrainian delegation and the American one. Well, yesterday the Russians and Americans talked for about 12 hours, and for some reason it seems to me that they could have talked. They discussed not only the ceasefire, but also other details, a lot of things. And there are concerns that the US might have still conceded to their own formula, which suggested that first, Abid, it is necessary to talk about Plan A, as stated by US Secretary of State Marco Rubio the day before. Plan A, which involves first achieving a ceasefire, and only then moving to Plan B, directly discussing the issue of peaceful settlement and further points from this. Therefore, there are serious concerns here. Let's see what they will announce. I will definitely keep you informed, so subscribe to my channel if you haven't done so yet, like this video, and write your comments and opinions on what you think. And today I will pose a question for you. What do you think? How much will the meetings in Saudi Arabia this week accelerate the onset of a ceasefire followed by a negotiation process for peace? What are your impressions? My audience is very interested in your opinion on whether it will succeed or not, and whether Ukraine's interests will be taken into account. And Ukraine, in turn, is doing everything possible to truly, as the president noted, impress and maintain sovereignty. That was ours. This has been taken into account. So please write. Well, and meanwhile, US Vice President Jay Devins defended Donald Trump's special envoy Steve Witkoff, who has been criticized for recent statements about Ukraine. Here's what Jay Devins wrote on his X page. Vince emphasized that Steve Witkoff is doing an incredible job. According to the vice president, those who criticize him are going crazy because he has succeeded, where they have been failing for 40 years. It turns out that a large part of diplomacy comes down to the simple skill of not being an idiot. Well, who was failing, for example, let's sort it out with facts. I don't want to get into any, outbursts of emotions. And I can't debate with a person who doesn't provide intellectual justifications and arguments, but instead makes claims without knowing the issue here. Well, maybe due to Witkoff's tests. After all, the representative for the Middle East was there from the beginning, not for Russia, where he shows amateurism. So, regarding actions, well, look at the special representative for the Middle East, Witkoff. Right now, the USA has started strikes. Well, Recently, against the Houthis in Yemen, the USA issued an ultimatum to Iran. And once again, they are stuck in place, unable to resolve the issue of stopping Iran's nuclear program. And right now, Israel is considering a new large-scale ground military operation against the Gaza Strip. The war continues, it hasn't stopped, and on the contrary, it could escalate and flare up with even greater intensity. And the situation is uncertain in Syria, where Israel and Turkey have very serious disagreements. So, where is the success? Well, these are the real facts. There is a special representative for the Middle East. What is the success as of today? Based on what I mentioned, that's it. There you have it. And the answer. And there's a major scandal in the United States right now, making the front pages of leading publications like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. Others published articles about a leak of information that occurred precisely through the National Security Advisor to the US President, Michael Waltz, who accidentally added it to a chat in Signal. And the chat in Signal was called Houthi Peace Small Group, meaning a small group regarding the Houthis. This chat in Signal was created for planning strikes against Yemeni Houthis, and among others, it included the head of the Pentagon under Hexit, Vice President Jay Divins, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and other high-ranking officials and officers. The editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, Jeffrey Goldberg, was accidentally added. Initially, Goldberg didn't believe it because this is a real chat where discussions happen like this in real time, through a regular messenger, albeit a very secure one like Signal. But then they started discussing the issue of striking Yemeni Houthis, and Goldberg was convinced of this when he actually saw that the strikes were being discussed there, and in fact, they were carried out. Well, all possible failures. As noted here, let's say the chat users needed to speculate on whom. Well, of course, on the predecessors, on President Joe Biden, blaming him for everything, saying that Trump would act differently. Well, Trump, when asked this question, denied it, saying he had nothing to do with it. Currently, nothing is known about these circumstances. And in general, and in the USA, there are currently active discussions because, at the very least, such actions, according to American law, entail disciplinary responsibility. And as the authors of the publication in the New York Times rightly point out, everyone, well, very much. Many participants in this chat previously criticized Hillary Clinton during the 2016 election campaign for the fact that she used unsecured communication means and, for example, used personal email for the official purposes. Well, now we see that there is such a blunder, and it is indeed a big scandal. It is currently powerful in the USA because some unnamed sources to whom the New York Times reached out. And these are people who worked earlier in the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation of the USA. They note that it might even involve a violation of the Espionage Act, that is, the Act Against Espionage. So for this, a completely different responsibility is already provided. And now senators and congressmen are deciding on the issue of hearing the situation accordingly and creating investigative commissions. That's how it is, because indeed, for the understanding of the United States, this situation is quite problematic, and it's a scandal. As noted by the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, Jeffrey Goldberg, who was accidentally added to the secret chat, he wrote a large article about this. He cites messages from Pete Hegseth and the US Secretary of Defense in this chat where strikes on the Houthis and the political aspects of this attack are discussed. He addresses Vice President J.D. Vance. Vice President, I understand your concerns and fully support your appeal to the President. Important considerations, most of which are difficult to predict. Difficult to predict. Economy, peace in Ukraine, Gaza sector. I think that conveying information will be difficult, no, regardless of anything. No one knows who the Houthis are, which is why we must remain focused on this issue. First, Biden failed. Second, Iran is funding. Well, again, I say they blame their predecessors. They say Biden failed. Well, Iran is funding. In general, regarding the fact that no one knows who the Houthis are. But what were the concerns? J.D. Vance? J.D. Vance was concerned about, what was he afraid of? He wasn't afraid of the consequences for the USA. He was afraid of the positive consequences for Europe, because J.D. Vance was precisely wary of that. The USA will help European countries, Western countries, to receive goods through trade routes. As a result of the fact that the pirates will stop attacking trade ships in the Gulf of Aden, and this will ultimately lead to more goods, more opportunities for their transportation, and accordingly, it will improve the economic and logistical situation for Western European countries where, through the Gulf of Aden, then through the Suez Canal, these goods are actually exported from Southeast Asian countries. This is what J. Divens was wary of, because Europeans are not liked. Well, here is yet another confirmation. Meanwhile, the president of the Czech Republic, Petr Pavel, notes and believes that the Russian war against Ukraine will most realistically end with a compromise and concessions. He noted that in an article at the beginning of 2023, he believed that Ukraine should prepare not for victory, but for concessions, and that it will not be possible to restore control over the borders. For me, it was quite obvious at the time, considering that Western countries would not be able to come to Ukraine's aid with their armies, as that would mean a war between NATO and Russia. Therefore, it was only about material support, and even this support was not provided to such an extent that it would allow Ukraine to quickly win the war. But the main thing is that Ukraine could only rely on its own human resources, and they are limited, and of course much less than those of Russia. Nevertheless, Ukraine has been holding on for so long. It is holding on. We see that indeed. Continues to hold on, but another minister, not the president, and the minister of a neighboring country, Radosław Sikorski, notes the following. He gave an interview in Poland to Polish radio Talk FM, and he says that currently Russia is unable to help Ukraine without external assistance. Well, it is already receiving external assistance with North Korean troops sent, and to this day, Ukraine does not receive support in the form of troops. And you see how it fights against Russia, against superior forces, the enemy, because of spirit, because of strength, because of the sense of duty and protection of one's own homeland and all of us. That's what drives it. And we see it. But Sikorski noted that Russia is unable to help. However, if Kiev is forced to capitulate, Russia will seize Ukrainian resources and the balance of power will change. In such a case, the possibility of large-scale aggression by Moscow by the end of the decade must be considered. Look how everything comes together. Remember, I emphasized the year 2030. The year 2030 was mentioned in the address by French President Emmanuel Macron to the nation at the beginning of March. The year 2030, it was mentioned in the forecasts of the BND, the German intelligence agency, as stated by its director Bruno Kahl. 2030 is noted in the program documents currently being considered by the European Union, but regarding deepening funding for the defense and security sector and the defense industrial complex. And here the year 2030 aligns with many things in the words of Radosław Sikorski. It is precisely for this that preparations are being made up to 2030, and beyond that, whether the war should continue or how to maintain it, perhaps still to help and support Ukraine once and for all to defeat Russia. But look, here, what diplomatic maneuvers, how the Polish minister navigates, what does he say? At the same time, he hopes that the negotiations in Saudi Arabia between Ukraine, the USA, and Russia may lead to a breakthrough. According to him, the key goal of the international community should be the protection of Ukrainian sovereignty. The most important thing is for Ukraine to survive as a country that chooses its own leaders and controls most of its territories, and determines the directions of integration, notes V. Sikorski, meaning some territory somewhere in Ukraine. Well, that is, it is not even anticipated that this territory will be fully restored, most of its territory. Well, this is how we see the position is. Meanwhile, China has denied that they plan to send their peacekeepers, as stated by the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Let's see how much this will correspond. The British publication The Telegraph at the same time reports that Donald Trump, the president of the USA, is allegedly increasingly angry due to the missile attacks and drone strikes on Ukrainian territory by Russia, which are not subsiding. Citing their sources, they note that he will be disappointed if Ukraine and Russia continue to strike infrastructure facilities. And energy, said a source close to the administration, and they noted that Trump is ready to wait for a favorable deal. However, some have stated that the head of the White House is increasingly angered by missile attacks and drone attacks, despite the promise of both sides for a partial truce. Well, as Russia attacks, Ukraine will respond to it. The president clearly stated, "This is a matter of our survival, and we will act based on the protection of Ukrainian interests." At the same time, the Telegraph reports that in the British Army there is criticism of the United Kingdom's Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, and there it is noted that Starmer, forgive me, please, I misspoken, that Starmer got ahead of himself with talks about military intervention before he understood what he was talking about. That's why now we hear less about this and more about planes and ships, which are easier and do not require basing in Ukraine, making them easier to deploy. Russia and the USA support the coalition, do not support the coalition if it is led by Britain. Additionally, the negotiations are complicated by the fact that no one knows what the mission still entails. What can tens of thousands of international forces do, stationed more than 400 kilometers from the front? They cannot protect themselves. Here, the politics have no military component, a source noted. I just don't understand whether the source, let's say, is disappointed that they won't be on the front line and able to fight, or that they are being sent to Ukraine at all. This is the fundamental question. And Romania and Bulgaria are concerned about the negotiations in Saudi Arabia regarding the Black Sea. In fact, this is very serious. This is reported by the Financial Times. What is the concern? So the concern here is that Russia might gain more advantages in the Black Sea. This needs to be listened to. The Romanians apparently know something. They have a strong intelligence structure. It is in Romania that the largest NATO base is currently being built, with a cost of $2.5 billion. Well, unless Trump cuts the funding, which is possible, and Romania claims that it will become the largest security center concerning Black Sea security. And therefore, if they are very concerned, they know something. And it is very important not to allow the situation to improve for the Russian Black Sea fleet in the Black Sea. They are afraid of Ukrainian surface drones, which are hitting them very well. And they have already sunk many ships, and Russia is forced to hide in unrecognized Abkhazia. Therefore, it is necessary to closely monitor this issue, specifically regarding the Black Sea. Every detail is important, and I will keep you informed in the future. And now, I remind you that despite everything, we are moving forward, with confidence and God's help. And we will overcome everything. Take care of yourselves and glory to Ukraine.